Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to talk a little bit, or quite a bit, about why ISFJs are very different from INFJs. They're much more distant than their common, three letters might suggest. And this will obviously lead me to investigate the SI function in a little bit of detail. So if you're interested in this video, stick around. Apologies if there is some background noise. It's not, there's no machinery or anything like this. There's just a storm. There's a storm going on. So if there is noise, it's just a natural element. And don't forget that I have written a reference book on the INFJ, the Ecstatic Soul. Check out the links below if you haven't got the book. If you want a real deep understanding of the type, this is just the book to get. I've also written a novel a couple of years ago, The Infinite Castle, and the rumor has it that the main character is an INFJ. So if you want to look it up, see if you might be into this kind of fiction. Kafka, Murakami, Dostoevsky, and Camus, and existentialism. This might be your bag. Really supports my work, provides me with some income. So does supporting me with even a very modest contribution on Patreon down below. Got two new followers, paid subscribers recently. I thank them very much. This is exactly the kind of thing that helped me. And you get some bonus content every couple of weeks, with bits of, videos that I make exclusively for you guys, for patrons. So now let's move back to this question of the ISFJ and the SI function. There's different views, in the personality community as regards which type is the closest to the INFJ. And often, or I should say rather all the time, nearly all the time, the disagreements will be between the three types that have three letters in common with the INFJ. Okay, so you've got obviously the ENFJ. You've got the ISFJ, you've got the INTJ, and you've got the INFP. That's actually four types, not three. My apologies. Of course, four letters in INFJ, four types that have three letters in common with INFJ. So just quickly to repeat, ENFJ, ISFJ, INTJ, and INFP. Oftentimes, what people start doing is they eliminate INFP. Not everybody does that. It tends to be people who have a knowledge of, the theory of the cognitive functions, the Jungian cognitive functions that underlie this simple letter code. And so they know that according to the way that the theory of the cognitive function is linked to the letter code, INFPs in fact have no functions in common with INFJs, so they cannot be particularly similar. And I think this case has merit, and certainly I would never hold that INFP is the closest to INFJ, right? So we're left with INTJ, ISFJ, and ENFJ. I think the real battle is ultimately going to be about INTJ versus ENFJ. And this for pretty obvious reasons. The advantage of the ENFJ is that they have a very strong, they have very strong correlation in terms of cognitive functions. Same cognitive functions, there's displacement of one function to the left or the right, depending on how you look at it. So very, very similar. The INTJ doesn't have that, only two functions in common, NI and SE. However, they share something that is extremely important, which INFJs don't share with ENFJs. That's similar dominant function and introvert intuition. Dominant introvert intuition accompanied by auxiliary FE is quite different from dominant FE accompanied by even strong auxiliary NI. But this might be the discussion of a future video if you let me know in the comments that you would like me to explore ENFJ versus INTJ, because again, I think these are the two serious contenders. However, ISFJ has always been a type that INFJs have found some resonance with. At least a good few INFJs have found some resonance with. And you do find the occasional person who holds that they are the closest type to the INFJ because they're IFJ types. And they hold essentially what has to be drawn from this is that of all the different letters, and particularly of all the different functions, what matters the most is the function of introverted perception. That's what it holds, right? For similarity to the INFJs, the function of introverted perception. NI for INFJs, SI for ISFJs. Now, if we follow this argument through, we'd have to hold that it is INTJ that's the closest. But I think people who hold the view that ISFJ tops INTJ is that the difference between NI and SI is not such as to be on balance overwhelmed by what's in the case of the ISFJ strength of having an FETI axis like the INFJ, which is not the case of the INTJ. Now, NI and SI, it's true. What's really interesting about these two functions, the PI functions, the functions of introverted perception, there's something very true and something very false about bringing them really closely together. What's really true is that they share a lot in common. What's really false is that next to all this share in common, there's almost like an inversion that takes place, such as a lot of what defines NI you can easily find in SI, but almost as if you were to add a minus sign to it. And that creates a world of difference, cognitively and phenomenologically, in terms of how you experience the world. I want to draw your attention to perhaps what is the most crucial difference, okay? Because I've made a lot of videos on NI lately, and I've talked a lot about archetypes, the relationship to time, the relationship to the eternal, the distinction between eternal as timelessness and the eternal as an eternity, as gathered time. That is to say, like everything that's happened and will happen gathered in a single instant. And as you remember, what I was saying is that this view, the latter view, is very consonant with introverted intuition. It's a view, by the way, that is actually quite prominent in Christianity. It's the dominant view of God's time in Christianity. And it's very, very germane to the Jungian conception of archetypes, because the idea of eternity as gathered times allows you to keep the archetype as a concept, the concept of something concrete rather than something abstract, right? If you think of timelessness, there's no way to capture this idea other than as an abstraction. If you think of eternity as gathered time, you can think of a concrete hypercondensation of all moments, and therefore you remain concrete. Now, it's fascinating because people would tend to think that if they were first asked, they would tend to think that SI is more concrete and that NI is more abstract. This is something that I'm sure you've heard, and it's possible that quite a few among you sympathize with this idea. Well, I would like to challenge this idea. Will you allow yourself to be challenged? Because maybe this idea is part of a background set of assumptions that you use to interpret types and debate about types. And if it's in the background set of your assumptions, it's all the more difficult to challenge, because you often espouse these views, and everybody, including myself, have background assumptions. We espouse many of them unconsciously. And in fact, it's necessary for most of them to be not conscious. And that's a philosophical point that I can explore in a future video if you would like me to as well. We always think with a background set of, if you like, pre-understandings that need to be there in order for our understanding to make sense. And the background understanding can never be made fully explicit. Some of it can be made explicit, not the whole of it. Otherwise, we fall into incoherence. I can talk about it if you would like me to in a future video. In the case of SI and in the case of NI, I would argue that the SI user, when faced with the question of eternity, whether in terms of religion or in terms of philosophy or in terms of this or in terms of that, they're not going to be particularly attracted to the archetypes. Why are they not going to be particularly attracted to the archetypes? Well, because, like I said before, for the idea of the archetypes to be appealing to you at a very visceral level, and then after the visceral, at an intellectual level, you have to be geared cognitively to experience reality as constellated by what we might refer to as isomorphisms, where something that happened in the past seems to be happening now, or something that's happening elsewhere or in a different field seems to be happening now, here, and in your field. You see the parallels. Sometimes we talk of NI as this bringing together of apparently very different concepts to show the synthesis, or rather to show the unity through the synthesis. We think of Hegel among philosophers, if you're familiar, or Marx, his disciple. NI has this, NI always sees the repetition of particular forms and structures across time and space, which is why you can have the complete incarnation of this and condensation of this set of similar structures in an archetype. SI doesn't see, its introverted perception it's not, if you like, it's not geared to be sensitive to that. In fact, it's geared to being skeptical of that. SI has a tendency not to be more concrete. Perhaps SE is more concrete, but SI is not necessarily more concrete. What it tends to see is that everything that happens, every event that takes place, whether it's being or form, past, future, and the present, it has its own unique identity. If it's uniquely itself, it's literally what it is. It's not going to be repeated in the past or in the future. It's not sensitive to these isomorphisms. SI is always going to be skeptical and suspicious of this idea that, if you see an event that is happening now that looks a lot like an event in the past, NI is going to automatically almost want to explore how the first event is a prototype of what's happening now. It belongs to the nature of NI to want to make that jump. The first reflex of SI is, wait a second, they may look similar, but they're fundamentally different. At different time, different spaces. So don't make these jumps, okay? It leads in philosophy to somewhat pompously, but it's the technical term, what we call nominalism as opposed to realism. Nominalism is defined by its rejection of universals. That is to say that if you have a cup of tea, in fact it's a coffee, or a dromedary, or an idea of a particular kind you have in your head, they're always instantiated. They're instantiation of a universal idea that applies everywhere. Okay, a universal. We've seen in a previous video that Plato made this his core conception and metaphysics, and that Jung was really innovative in terms of saying, actually, we're not talking about abstract universals, we're talking about concrete instantiations of archetypal condensations. But SI just doesn't have much time for that. SI tends to see this event happens at that time, and let's look at it in its very localized ideographic properties. Let's not start thinking of these big laws of, big structures, whatever. No, let's first look at what it is like in its fine detail. So where NI tends to want to see similarity between apparently different things or different events, right? So you have two units, NI, if they look apparently different, NI is going to want to see how they're actually connected, similar. So look for structural identity or at least similarity. SI will do the opposite. SI will tend to look for dissimilarity in apparently similar structures. Okay, so very, very different here. And in fact, once you've appreciated that, you're able to explain why SI can appear sometimes conservative in today's society. Paradoxically, SI can also appear very liberal in today's society. It's more the manner in which conservativeness is espoused, or the manner in which liberalism is espoused, that will define an SI stance as opposed to an NI stance. NI will always tend to be more revolutionary in intent and in worldview. Again, because it has this natural proclivity to seeing the repetition and instantiation of patterns across time. So it can be really ambitious in its world historical goals, because the world historical goals, the size of those goals for NI is reflected in the size of how NI expands to see the similarities, where SI tends to contract into literally just seeing every unit as what it is, separately from the others. So it tends to be suspicious of revolution, okay? But it's suspicious of revolution both in terms of being conservative, so like left-wing revolution. It's also suspicious of a conservative resolution, and in which case it will be left-wing conservative. So you see the big difference. Two functions of introverted perception that are very similar in terms of the fact that they do tend to encounter objects, events, and persons in the world according to a PI grid, if you like, introverted perception grid that they have in their mind. But whereas the NI grid tends to universalize, whether it does this in an abstract Platonic way or in a concretistic Jungian way is another question, which I discussed before. Tendency to universalize and to see similarities over differences. SI has a tendency to localize and see differences over similarities. From this, you can actually infer the conservatism or absence of conservatism in NI and in SI, whether left or right. And hence the fact that when we finally come to our ISFJs here, their experience of the world is going to be very, very, very different from that of INFJs. And you understand why. In a sense, you could argue that their relationship to reality, to space, time, objects, truth, falsity, and many other notions is going to be reversed. Universal versus local. Always keep this in mind. Similarity versus difference. Always keep this in mind. So this is not something that you're going to encounter with INTJs in comparison with INFJs. There'll be big differences in the manifestation of NI insights between the FE social way and the T mechanical way. But the NI is here and it's in common. Okay, so ISFJ is very different from INFJs despite superficial similarities. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please share your always very fruitful thoughts, and I'll see you tomorrow, guys. Take care.